I woke up that morning to the smell of something strange drifting through the air. It was faint at first, but there was a twinge of unease in my stomach. As I stepped onto the porch, the sun had barely risen, and the streets were quiet, yet the scent lingered. It was sweet yet suffocating, like metal and flowers, mixed in a way that should not exist. I shook my head, thinking perhaps it was the trash trucks or some neighbor burning leaves, but something in me would not let it go. I walked slowly down the street toward the corner where I had noticed a flicker of orange light in the early morning fog. I called out to Mr. Thompson, who was watering his garden, but he waved and went back to his plants. I knew I had to do something. I returned inside and dialed the city authorities. My hands trembled as I explained the smell that filled the air. I told them it could be gas, that there was a danger they could not ignore, yet I could hear the doubt in their voices, the polite dismissals, the soft assurances that everything was fine. I hung up with a pit in my stomach, the kind that tells you are alone, yet it also whispers that you must be brave. I walked back outside, breathing cautiously. I noticed Mrs. Delaney across the street. She had her robe on and was looking out her window. I waved, and she came down, clutching her coffee cup. We exchanged a glance that needed no words, and I told her what I had sensed, the danger, that maybe we should not wait for anyone else to act. Together we went door to door, neighbors opening their doors, rubbing their eyes, and looking bewildered when we told them what was happening. Some laughed nervously, some shook their heads. I could see the fear in their eyes mingled with the frustration that no one listened. Some said we should call the police again. Some said it must be nothing, but the more I walked, the more I smelled it, the more my chest tightened, and I knew time was slipping away like water through a sieve. I realized I could not wait for the authorities. I had to move the people myself. I organized a small meeting in the community center. The room was filled with murmurs and whispers. We spoke softly, at first sharing our fears. Some voices cracked, and tears formed in eyes. We had lived in this neighborhood for decades. We knew each other in ways that went beyond greetings and small talk, and yet the danger made us strangers, suddenly dependent on the courage of one another. I suggested we evacuate the streets block by block. We made a plan to knock on doors, to get everyone out, to bring pets to safety, to check on elderly neighbors who could not move quickly. By midday, the sun was higher and the smell had intensified. I could taste it in the back of my throat, a sharpness that made my eyes water. I moved quickly with Mrs. Delaney by my side. We banged on doors, shouted through windows, waved to people who were hesitant at first, but then followed our lead. Slowly the streets emptied, children holding teddy bears in one hand and parents holding keys and bags in the other. We walked them toward the high school gym, where we had set up a temporary safe zone. I could feel my heart hammering, but also a strange lightness that comes with action. I called the authorities again, explaining we had evacuated most of the neighborhood, that there was a serious problem that needed immediate response. This time their tone was urgent. We could hear the sirens and trucks in the distance. A team arrived in masks and protective gear. They cordoned off the area, began checking lines and valves, and the smell started to shift from sweet to acrid. Their faces tense. I stayed outside, watching my neighbors huddle together, some crying, some holding hands. I did not feel pride. I felt relief and a quiet exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones. It was hours before we knew that the leak had been severe, that a single spark could have set off an explosion that would have destroyed homes and lives. I stood there listening to the responders, thanking us quietly, the community looking at one another with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. I realized bravery is not in grand gestures, it is in the small decisions, to act when others do not, to move when others hesitate, to risk the discomfort of being wrong for the chance that you may be right. As the sun set, I walked back to my porch. The air cleared, the wind gentle. I sipped my tea, looking at the street that had been empty and now filled with cautious smiles and the laughter of children returning. I thought about the morning and the choices we made, the fear, the panic, the courage, and the unity. I realized that in those moments the neighborhood had changed forever. We had been witnesses to a danger, and we had acted. I felt a warmth in my chest that was not from the tea, but from knowing that Bravery can come from anyone, and sometimes from a 72-year-old woman who refused to ignore what others dismissed. As night fell, I could not sleep, the images of the day replaying like a silent movie in my mind, the smell that had haunted the streets, the faces of my neighbors, their confusion, fear, and eventual relief. It all lingered like a heavy fog. I walked slowly to the corner where I had first noticed the strange odor. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and I could almost hear the echoes of footsteps that had rushed to safety. I thought about the authorities, their hesitation, the voices that had brushed off my warnings, and I felt a quiet anger mixed with gratitude that we had not waited for anyone else to act. I remembered my husband, who had passed many years ago. He had always said that courage is not loud, it is persistent. It is the small decisions that accumulate into something larger than yourself. I could feel his presence that night, as if he were standing beside me, nodding approvingly. I smiled softly and whispered thank you into the wind. The cold air brushed against my face, and I felt alive in a way that fear and survival can make you feel alive. The neighborhood had been tested, and we had passed. I thought of Mrs. Delaney and how we had leaned on each other for strength, and I realized that bravery is not solitary, it is shared. The next morning, the news crews arrived, cameras and microphones, and reporters eager for a story. They wanted the hero angle, they wanted the dramatic rescue. I stood quietly in the background as my neighbors told their versions of events, some with embellishments, others with raw honesty. I let them speak. I did not need the spotlight. I had already lived the story. I had already felt the weight of each choice, each knock on a door, each shout to alert someone to move. I watched as the children drew pictures of firefighters and neighbors saving the day, and I felt tears welling in my eyes, because in those drawings was the purest truth of what had happened. The community had come together. I spent the day walking the streets, checking on homes, inspecting windows and doors with neighbors. We shared stories of past storms, fires, and small accidents that had brought us together in ways we never realized until danger forced our unity. I listened as people expressed guilt for doubting or ignoring the warnings. I shook my head, because doubt is human, because fear is natural, but the action we took despite doubt is what defines us. I told them repeatedly that it was not just me, it was all of us standing together that had prevented disaster. I began to notice small signs of change. The children no longer ran carelessly down the streets without acknowledging the presence of others. They waved and smiled at neighbors, and I felt pride in this subtle shift in awareness. The elderly neighbors who had been hesitant now offered advice to the young and helped organize safety measures for the future. I thought about the gas lines and the emergency protocols that were lacking, and I knew that the neighborhood had been lucky, but luck alone does not protect anyone. Action protects lives. Weeks passed, and the story of our evacuation spread through the town. Newspapers, online forums, and television segments recounted the events, and interviews with my neighbors highlighted the courage we had shown. Yet the media always wanted a single face, a hero, a woman who saved the neighborhood, and I quietly accepted the attention with humility. I directed praise toward the volunteers, the friends, the neighbors, and the small acts of kindness that had made the difference. Every detail mattered. The mother who carried her baby on her hip, the teen who helped an elderly man down the steps, the neighbor who comforted someone in tears, each story a thread in the tapestry of survival. I reflected often on the moments that had defined the day, the first smell that woke me, the instinct to act, the repeated calls to authorities, the hesitant faces at each door, the adrenaline that had coursed through my veins like electricity. I realized that bravery is not always about triumph, it is about persistence. It is about continuing to knock when no one opens the door, continuing to speak when no one listens, continuing to care when the world seems indifferent. The real danger had not been the gas, it had been inaction and the quiet complacency that could have cost lives. At night, I still dream sometimes of the day, the streets filled with people, the trucks arriving, the sirens screaming. I feel the fear and the relief simultaneously. It is a vivid reminder of the fragility of life and the strength of a community. I have begun teaching small groups about emergency preparedness, sharing my experiences and the lessons learned. I speak of courage not as a distant concept, but as something tangible that anyone can practice. The stories of my neighbors now intertwine with Mine, and I see that bravery multiplies when shared. It is contagious. It spreads quietly in smiles, in helping hands, and vigilance. I remember standing in the gym with neighbors huddled together for warmth and safety, the children asleep on mats, the adults whispering quietly to comfort one another, and I felt a deep connection to everyone present. There was no pretense, no judgment, only unity and trust. One recall the quiet moments when someone would glance at me and smile with gratitude, and I would nod, understanding that this was the truest reward, the knowledge that we had protected one another, and nothing else mattered more. The authorities eventually conducted a full investigation, repairing the lines and ensuring proper safety measures were in place. But I knew that their arrival had only come because we had acted swiftly and decisively. It was a reminder that systems are imperfect and that ordinary people often carry the weight of responsibility when bureaucracy hesitates. I spoke to city officials advocating for better safety measures for all neighborhoods, emphasizing the importance of listening to the voices of residents and recognizing potential dangers before tragedy strikes. I realized that change comes slowly, but every step matters. Even now, when I walk the streets, I notice subtle shifts, a new sense of attentiveness, a cautious respect for neighbors. I smile at young parents teaching their children to recognize danger, and the elderly sharing stories of survival. I feel hope that the lessons of that day will ripple through generations, that bravery will not be forgotten, that community will continue to thrive, because we had faced fear together and emerged not broken but stronger. I remember sitting on my porch that evening, watching the sun dip below the rooftops, the streets quiet again, but alive with a new kind of energy. I could feel it in the laughter of children playing in the yards again, in the cautious but proud steps of neighbors walking dogs or talking on their phones. The air smelled clean and ordinary, but I could not forget the way it had burned my nose, the way it had stung my throat that morning, the memory sharp and vivid like a photograph. I thought about the long line of events that had led to our survival, each choice, each hesitation, each act of courage, small and large, intertwined like threads in a tapestry. I found myself thinking of my own past as I rocked slowly on the porch chair, memories flooding in of when I was a young woman raising my children, when the world seemed simpler yet still filled with dangers of its own. I remembered nights of storms when the wind tore through the trees and I had comforted my children with blankets and whispered that everything would be okay. Even when I was not sure myself, I thought of lessons learned from my mother, from friends, from strangers who had shown me kindness and bravery without knowing they were teaching me the tools I would need decades later to face an invisible threat in my own neighborhood. I walked the streets often that week, checking on houses, checking fences and windows, and speaking to neighbors who wanted reassurance, who wanted to talk about fear and gratitude. I listened as they shared stories of family members who had been sick or afraid or hesitant to act, and I reminded them gently that action is more powerful than fear, that standing still and hoping for miracles rarely prevents disaster, but choosing to act even when uncertain can save lives. I saw nods and tears and smiles, and I realized that courage is contagious, and that once ignited, it spreads faster than panic. One afternoon, Mrs. Delaney and I walked to the corner store to pick up groceries, and as we passed familiar houses, I noticed subtle marks of vigilance: a new lock here, a fire extinguisher there, emergency numbers posted near doors. The children now played in small groups with watchful eyes, and we exchanged glances, knowing that the invisible threads of responsibility had been rewoven through the neighborhood. It was a small victory, but it mattered deeply to see that the lesson of fear transformed into preparedness, and that the sense of helplessness we had felt initially had blossomed into collective strength. The media had not forgotten our story either, reporters and journalists seeking interviews and photographs. I sat quietly while others spoke, giving voice to what had happened, but always emphasizing that it was a shared effort that had prevented tragedy. I noticed a shift in their questions as well, a growing respect for ordinary people acting extraordinarily. I recounted the calls I had made to authorities, the doors I had knocked on, the neighbors I had rallied, and the trust that had blossomed in our Community. I spoke with a calmness that surprised me even as I relived the tension and fear I had felt, the details vivid in my mind, as if it had all happened yesterday. I began keeping a journal after that, each entry a reflection on bravery, the fragility of life, the importance of community, and the quiet moments that define us more than the loud triumphs. I wrote about the children who had clung to their parents, the elderly who had shuffled carefully to safety, the pets carried in arms and baskets, and the neighbors who had inspired me with acts of kindness and decisiveness. I could feel their courage like a pulse in my chest, and writing it down made it permanent, made it a story that could be passed to others who might face fear in their own ways. There were nights when I woke startled, imagining what could have happened if I had hesitated, if a door had not opened, if a single person had ignored the warnings. I shivered at the thought, and yet I also smiled at the resilience I had witnessed in those hours, the laughter and tears mingling in ways that felt sacred. I thought of my late husband again, and the lessons he had taught me about persistence, about standing firm, about doing what you know is right even when the world is silent. I whispered into the night a promise to continue acting in the world, not for recognition, but because the act itself matters, because courage is the quiet voice that says keep going. Neighbors began gathering more often in the evenings, sharing meals, sharing stories, and reflecting on the day that had changed our lives forever. We held small meetings, discussing emergency plans, sharing contact numbers, checking on each other in ways we had taken for granted before. I listened as people recounted moments that had frightened them, moments when they had felt doubt but acted anyway, moments when they had held the hand of someone scared and led them to safety. I realized that bravery is not a single dramatic moment, it is a tapestry of choices woven over hours and days and years. The city officials eventually held a ceremony recognizing our community, the actions of neighbors who had stepped up, and the awareness we had raised. I attended quietly, nodding as speeches were made and cameras flashed. I thought about how fleeting recognition can be, how quickly attention can move to another story, yet I felt no disappointment because the real reward had already been received in the form of lives saved and bonds strengthened. I shook hands with volunteers and neighbors, and I thought about how courage had taken root not in fame, but in everyday acts that together became extraordinary. In the days that followed, I spent hours walking the streets, checking on every house, every window, every corner. I knew we had survived the immediate danger, but the echoes of fear lingered in quiet ways. I stopped by the homes of elderly neighbors, making sure they had enough food and water. I helped Mrs. Thompson carry groceries up the steps. For the first time, I realized that survival is not just about avoiding disaster, it is about creating a safety net for everyone around you. It is about noticing the small things, the open doors, the smiles, the hands extended to help each other, and I felt a warmth that went deeper than relief, deeper than pride. Children approached me shyly, some tugging at their parents' sleeves, some holding drawings they had made of firefighters and neighbors saving the day. They wanted to tell me their stories, to show me what they had seen. I knelt down to listen to each one, to smile and nod as they recounted the fear, the panic, and the eventual joy. I told them that their bravery mattered, that even noticing danger and telling someone is an act of courage. I saw their eyes light up, and I felt a spark of hope because these were the future caretakers of this neighborhood, the ones who would carry forward the lessons of vigilance and compassion that had been born out of a terrifying day. I remembered my own children, long gone now, adults living their own lives in other cities. I thought about the fears I had carried for them when they were small, and how I had walked them through storms and scraped knees and heartbreaks, and now I felt the same maternal vigilance for a whole community, for strangers who had become family. I understood that bravery is never limited, it expands outward, it grows as you act. It is a seed planted in moments of fear that blooms over time with care and attention. One afternoon, I found myself sitting with a group of neighbors under the shade of an old oak tree, sharing tea and sandwiches. We talked quietly about the day, the smell, the panic, the running, the calls to authorities, and the way we had held each other together in ways that words cannot fully capture. I listened as a mother recounted how she had carried her youngest down 3 flights of stairs, and the older child had held her hand, the tremor in her voice revealing the terror she had felt. I nodded, gently telling her how proud I was of her, how proud we all should be of each other, and the quiet gratitude in the circle was almost palpable. I began to notice subtle changes in the neighborhood, the children playing in organized games, watching out for each other, the teens walking in pairs, checking on the elderly, the adults speaking more openly about fears and safety. I realized that bravery had created a ripple effect, not just in that day, but in the fabric of daily life. We had transformed uncertainty into preparedness, worry into vigilance, and fear into shared strength. It was a profound lesson that life often teaches in the most unexpected and frightening ways. The media attention continued sporadically with interviews and features on local news outlets. I always emphasized the community, the neighbors, the shared responsibility, the ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I spoke calmly, remembering every detail. Every knock, every door, every glance that had carried reassurance or panic, and I felt the weight of those moments lift slightly with each telling, because sharing stories gives them life and power, and also reminds us that courage is not owned by one person, but by everyone willing to act when others hesitate. One evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the quiet streets, I stood on my porch looking out at the houses and lawns and trees, and I thought about the fragility of life and the strength that lies in ordinary choices. I thought about the small acts of kindness. That day had revealed the neighbor who stayed behind to comfort a frightened child, the man who checked each car to make sure no one was trapped, the young woman who ran to fetch blankets and water. I realized that heroes are often anonymous, that bravery does not require applause, but only action and presence and a willingness to do what is right. Months passed, and the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm shaped by shared experience and reinforced vigilance. I saw neighbors exchanging contact information. I noticed small emergency kits appearing in homes. I observed children practicing fire drills and parents discussing what to do in case of gas leaks or storms. The lessons of that terrifying morning had become part of daily life, and I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that something good had come out of fear, that survival had led to preparation and unity. I began writing a series of letters to my family and friends, recounting the events, detailing every action, every emotion, every lesson learned. I wanted them to understand that ordinary people can prevent extraordinary disasters, that waiting for someone else to act can be deadly, and that courage is cultivated through persistence and care. I included sketches of maps of the neighborhood evacuation routes, photos of neighbors helping one another, and reflections on the emotional journey, because I knew that sharing these experiences can teach as much as any manual or lecture can. The day came when the city formally recognized the community's efforts with a small ceremony. The fire chief and local officials spoke of bravery and vigilance, of the importance of listening to citizens, and of the extraordinary actions taken that day. I stood quietly as neighbors accepted awards and thanks, but I felt no need for recognition. The true reward had already been felt in every rescued life, every grateful smile, every child sleeping safely. That night, I realized that heroism often lives in quiet moments unnoticed, and that the value of courage is in action, not accolades. I often reflect on the subtle lessons of that day that changed my life and the lives of my neighbors forever. I think about the invisible threads that connect us, the way we look out for each other, the small decisions that prevent disaster. I remember the fear, the tension, the adrenaline, the uncertainty, and the immense relief and pride I felt knowing we had acted decisively, knowing that inaction would have had consequences too terrible to imagine. I feel gratitude for my instincts, for the support of neighbors, for the strength that rose when needed most, and for the community that proved that courage is collective. Even now, when I walk past the corner where the first smell hit me, the street calm and serene, I feel a quiet respect for life and the bonds we share. I smile at children playing, I nod at parents chatting, I wave to elderly neighbors tending their gardens, and I think about the morning we faced danger together. I feel a pulse of bravery still alive in the air, a reminder that courage is not a memory, it is a living force that flows through ordinary people when they choose to act. I whisper a silent thank you to the universe and to the neighbors and friends who joined me, and I feel whole. Years have passed since that morning when the smell first reached my nose, yet the memory is as vivid as if it were yesterday. I think of the streets of my neighborhood, the children who once clutched teddy bears running from danger, now grown with their own families and their own stories to tell. I walk past the houses and remember every door I knocked on, every face I saw, the fear, the hesitation, the gratitude, the relief. I remember how ordinary people became extraordinary when faced with a choice to act, and I realize that bravery is not confined to a single moment. It lives on in every decision we make afterward. Sometimes I visit the school where we had gathered, the children, now older, remember the day differently, some with heroism in their story, some with fear lingering in their voice. I speak to them quietly, reminding them that courage is not always about loud gestures. It is about noticing danger. It is about caring. It is about choosing to act when others do not. I see their eyes light up with understanding, and sometimes I feel tears welling, because the legacy of that morning lives in them, in the way they will act for others, the way they will stand for what is right. I have come to understand that fear and courage are intertwined, that without fear we would not recognize the value of action, without doubt we would not appreciate the power of persistence. I often recall the hesitations I felt, the calls that went unanswered, the doors that did not open at first. Yet I also remember the moments of clarity, the hands extended to me, the faces of neighbors trusting one another. I realize that bravery is a living force. It grows when nurtured by community and shared experience. It is strengthened by small acts of kindness and vigilance, and it becomes a part of who we are. The neighborhood is forever changed. We now have emergency plans in place, community meetings that focus on preparedness, regular check-ins, and drills that remind us all that safety is a responsibility we share. We celebrate small victories and learn from mistakes. I see neighbors watching out for one another, helping each other carry groceries, offering rides, or simply being present when someone is afraid. I smile quietly, knowing that the courage we discovered has become woven into the fabric of daily life, that it is no longer extraordinary because it is ordinary for us now. I think often of the authorities who initially ignored the warning, the calls that went unheeded, the polite dismissals. I no longer feel anger. Instead, I feel understanding, that people follow procedure, that systems are imperfect, that bureaucracy moves slowly. Yet I also know that if I had waited for them, we might have lost everything. The lesson remains clear, that ordinary people must sometimes take extraordinary responsibility, that waiting for someone else can be deadly, and acting with courage, even in uncertainty, can change the course of lives. In the quiet moments of my day, I reflect on the personal lessons learned, the endurance required, the strength I did not know I possessed, the resilience that grew in me through fear and uncertainty. I write letters and notes reminding my family, friends, and neighbors that life is precious, fragile, and unpredictable, and that courage is cultivated in those moments when we choose to act for others and ourselves. I see now that the invisible threads of bravery stretch beyond that single morning, connecting me to strangers, to friends, to children and grandchildren who will carry the lesson forward. Sometimes I close my eyes and replay the sounds of that day, the sirens in the distance, the shouts of neighbors warning one another, the pounding of feet on pavement, the cries of children, the soft reassurances of parents. I feel again the adrenaline, the fear, the unity. I see the faces of my neighbors etched into my memory, the courage in their eyes, the trembling hands reaching out to help. I feel a quiet gratitude for having been part of something larger than myself, and I realize that courage is immortal in the memories we carry and the lives we touch. I think about my own aging body, my hands lined and worn, yet still capable, my heart still beating with vigilance. I know that time moves quickly, and that each day offers opportunities to act, to care, to notice, to protect. I walk the streets slowly now, greeting neighbors and children, the stories of the past whispered into the present. I see bravery in the young and the elderly, in the quiet gestures that might seem insignificant, but are profound in their impact. I feel proud not of myself alone, but of the community that chose to rise when danger threatened. And as I sit on my porch, watching the sunset casting golden light across the rooftops, I feel a sense of peace. The streets calm, the air clear, the children playing safely, the neighbors chatting warmly, the pets running through yards. I think of the day, the danger, the fear, the unity, And I smile quietly because I know that in that moment of crisis we discovered who we truly are as a community, as neighbors, as human beings willing to act to protect one another. I whisper a final thank you to the universe, to the neighborhood, to the invisible threads of courage that connect us all. I realize finally that bravery does not belong to the young or the strong or the famous. It belongs to anyone willing to act despite fear. It belongs to anyone who chooses to knock on a door when the world hesitates, to anyone who stands when others turn away. It belongs to everyone who sees danger and does not ignore it, who feels fear but does not let it paralyze them, who understands that ordinary people can create extraordinary outcomes when they act with care, persistence, and courage. And I feel a deep contentment knowing that we did exactly that, and that the story will live on in the hearts and actions of those who remember.